March 23rd, 1475. Let me tell you how it begins. Not with screams, not with fire. It begins with a boy playing outside his father's door. His name is Simon. He is 2 years old, and the world has not yet taught him what fear tastes like. The sun is setting over Trent. The Alps hold the cold in their shadow. His mother calls him inside. But the boy does not come. By nightfall, the streets are lit with torches. Men with lanterns call his name into the dark. They will not find him. Not tonight. When they do find him, days later, Easter Sunday, in the water beneath a moneylender's house, something shifts. Not justice. Something else. Because what happened next was never about a boy. It was not a crime scene. It was not an investigation. It was a performance. A story written in blood, screamed under torture, and pressed into the soul of Europe with ink and woodcut and the terrifying new machinery of print. This is not a story about a murder. This is a story about how a lie becomes immortal. How a child who never harmed anyone becomes a weapon. How 15 men burn at the stake and 500 years later the same fire still finds someone new to consume. Simon of Trent. Remember that name? Not because he was a martyr, but because he was never allowed to just be a dead child. He was made into something else. A myth, a justification, a ghost that does not know how to stay buried. Trent, 1475. Let me tell you what this city was. Not the Trent you would find today. No tourist streets, no mountain cafes. This was a prince-bishopric, which meant that God and government wore the same crown. The man who held that crown was named Johannes Hinderbach. He was not a gentle shepherd. He was a builder of walls, a keeper of ledgers, a man who understood that power in a city this small is a thing you must grip with both hands. And Trent was small, a valley town tucked into the Alps, where everyone knew everyone, where strangers were noticed, where the mountains themselves seemed to press down on the rooftops. Into this closed fist of a city came a Franciscan friar. His name was Bernardine of Feltre, and he was not there to pray quietly. He arrived during Lent, the season when Catholics scrape their souls clean, and he filled the void with fire. His sermons were not sermons. They were performances. He spoke of usury, of the Jews who bled the poor dry with their loans, of the blood of Christ still crying out from the cobblestones of Europe. He spoke, and the crowds listened, and the crowds grew hungry. Then, just before the storm broke, Bernardine left. He walked out of Trent as if his work was done. Perhaps he knew what was coming. Perhaps he lit the fuse and simply stepped back. On the evening of March 23rd, a child named Simon, son of a tanner named Andreas, was playing outside his father's door. 2 years old enough to wander, young enough to vanish in the space between one breath and the next. His mother called. His father searched. Neighbors lit torches. But the boy did not answer. For 3 days, the city held its breath. They searched the wells, the cellars, the narrow alleys where the sun never reached. They searched the canal that ran beneath the houses of the Jewish quarter, a place where water moved slow and silent through the dark. They found nothing. Then, on Easter Sunday, the holiest day of the Christian calendar, a child's body was pulled from that canal. It was found directly beneath the home of a Jewish moneylender named Samuel. The Jews of Trent were the ones who reported it. They went to the authorities themselves. It was an act of good faith. It would be repaid with fire. Because once the body was found, the story was no longer about a missing boy. It was about something else entirely. Something that had been waiting in the wings since the first sermon Bernardine preached. The city had held its breath. Now it would exhale, and that breath would burn. They came for them at dawn, all of them, every Jew in Trent, men, women, children, pulled from their beds, dragged through streets still wet with Easter rain, thrown into cells cut from stone. There was no evidence. There did not need to be. The body had been found in Samuel's canal, and that was enough. That was always going to be enough. The city had its explanation now. The sermons had planted the seed, and the dead child had watered it. What came next was not justice. Justice is slow. Justice asks questions. What came next was a machine, and machines do not ask. They grind. The Prince-Bishop Johannes Hinderbach took personal command. He was a lawyer by training, which meant he knew exactly how to make murder look like law. The legal code of the time allowed for torture, not as punishment, but as a way to extract truth. The theory was simple. A guilty man would confess under pain. An innocent man would endure it and be released. The theory was a lie, of course. Everyone in that room knew it was a lie. But lies, when spoken from a judge's chair, have a way of becoming truth. They began with Samuel, the moneylender in whose canal the boy was found. They bound his hands behind his back, tied a rope to his wrists, and hoisted him into the air. The strappado, they called it. A fall of a few feet stopped short, shoulders pulled from their sockets. They let him hang there, spinning slow, and asked him again, "What did you do to the boy?" He said nothing. So they dropped him further. Again, until the joints gave way and the screams filled the chamber and the words began to flow. Not truth, words. They asked him who helped. He gave names. Names of men he had known for years, men he had prayed with, men who had done nothing but exist in the same small community. Each name was a gift to his torturers. Each name was another rope, another body lifted into the air. They brought in the others, one by one. Tobias, Moses, Israel, Engel. Each man was given the same choice. Confess, and the pain stops. Name names, and the pain stops. The machine was efficient. It produced confessions. Beautiful, detailed confessions, rich with the blood the crowds wanted to hear. The men spoke of rituals in the synagogue, of the boy's blood drained into cups, of oaths sworn in secret. Each confession was a performance, dictated by the questions put to them. When details changed, when stories contradicted, the machine simply ground harder until the stories aligned. By the time the interrogators were finished, the Jews of Trent had confessed to a murder that never happened, committed in a ceremony that never existed, for reasons that had no basis in any text or tradition of their faith. But the machine did not care about truth. The machine cared about production. And on June 21st, 1475, the machine delivered its final product. 15 Jewish men were led to the stake outside the city walls. Their hands were bound. Wood was stacked at their feet. The crowd gathered. The same crowd that had listened to Bernardine's sermons, the same crowd that had searched for the boy, the same crowd that now stood in silence as the flames rose. 15 men. They burned. And when the fire died, when the ashes scattered, the city of Trent did something remarkable. It did not mourn. It did not question. It built a shrine, because the machine had done more than kill 15 men. It had manufactured a saint. And a saint, unlike a dead child, is immortal. The fires burned, the ashes settled, and Johannes Hinderbach, Prince-Bishop of Trent, looked at what he had built and saw that it was not enough. 15 dead Jews, a destroyed community. By any measure, it should have been finished, but Hinderbach was a man who understood something that few in his time understood. He understood that a lie, once spoken, must be defended. And he understood that the best defense is not silence, it is more words, more images, more noise. So he did something unprecedented. He built a propaganda machine, not with the crude tools of rumor and whispered gossip that had carried blood libels through the centuries before. Hinderbach had something new. He had the printing press. In 1475, this technology was barely a generation old. It was the internet of its age. Fast, disruptive, capable of spreading an idea across mountains and borders faster than any army could march. Hinderbach seized it with both hands. He commissioned books, pamphlets, poems, woodcuts. He hired the best artists, the best printers, the best storytellers money could buy. And he told the story of Simon of Trent. Over and over, in Latin for the educated, in German for the common, in images for the illiterate. Each version was the same. A child, innocent, taken, Jews, monstrous, drinking his blood. A martyr, glorious, ascending to heaven. The details did not need to match. They only needed to be repeated, and repeated, and repeated. The most famous of these images came not from Trent itself, but from the Nuremberg Chronicle of 1493, a massive illustrated history that became one of the best-selling books of the century. In its pages, a woodcut showed the scene in brutal detail. Jews gathered around a child, his small body stretched across a table, blood flowing into waiting vessels. The image was a lie. Every line of it was a lie. But it was printed, and printed, and printed again. Within a year of Simon's death, more than 100 miracles had been attributed to him. Pilgrims began arriving in Trent. They came to see the child's body, displayed in a crystal casket in the new shrine Hinderbach built. They came to pray. They came to be healed. They came with coins, and those coins filled the church's coffers. The lie had become an industry, and Hinderbach protected his industry with the ferocity of a man who knew that if the truth ever surfaced, everything he had built would crumble. When investigators from Rome arrived, sent by Pope Sixtus IV to examine the case, Hinderbach blocked them. When they tried to question witnesses, he denied them access. When the Pope himself began to suspect that the confessions had been extracted by torture, Hinderbach launched a counter-campaign. He wrote letters to princes and prelates across Europe. He warned them that Rome was being influenced by Jewish gold. He painted himself as the defender of Christendom, standing alone against a conspiracy that reached all the way to the Vatican. And it worked. The Pope backed down. The investigation was abandoned. The cult of Simon of Trent was permitted. In 1588, a later pope, Sixtus V, would make it official. Local veneration was allowed. Simon was, for all practical purposes, a saint. The boy who had played outside his father's door, who had wandered into a canal and drowned, who had never been anything more than a 2-year-old child, lost in the dark. That boy was now a weapon, a symbol, a justification for every hatred that followed. Hinderbach died in 1486, 11 years after the fires burned. But he had achieved what he wanted. He had made the lie immortal. He had taught Europe a story it would never forget, and the printing press he had mastered so well would spend the next 500 years teaching it again and again. The lie should have died with Hinderbach. It did not. The lie should have died when the truth came out, and the truth did come out again and again in the decades and centuries that followed. Investigators sent by Pope Sixtus IV in the immediate aftermath of the trial had already concluded that the confessions were worthless, extracted under torture, that no ritual murder had occurred, that the Jews of Trent had been murdered for a crime that never existed. The report was written, it was filed, and it was buried, because by then, the cult of Simon of Trent was too big to fail. Pilgrims were still coming. Miracles were still being claimed. The shrine was still generating revenue, and the story, the terrible, seductive story of innocent blood shed by Jewish hands, had taken root in the European imagination in ways that no papal decree could dig out, so the lie endured. Through the Reformation, through the Counter-Reformation, through wars and plagues and the rise and fall of empires, the child Simon remained in the calendar of saints. His image remained in books. His story remained in the mouths of preachers who needed a villain, of rulers who needed a scapegoat, of ordinary people who found comfort in the simple geometry of a story where the innocent suffer and the guilty burn. In 1588, Pope Sixtus V granted official permission for the veneration of Simon of Trent. The lie now wore the Vatican's ring. It would take nearly 400 years for another pope to remove it. But the lie did not simply sit in its shrine gathering dust. It traveled. It mutated. It found new hosts. In Hungary, in Poland, in Germany, in Bohemia, the blood libel, the accusation that Jews murdered Christian children for ritual purposes, spread like a contagion. Simon of Trent was not the first such case. There had been William of Norwich in 1144, Hugh of Lincoln in 1255, Werner of Oberwesel in 1287. But Simon was different. Simon was the one that the printing press made immortal. His story was the one with images, with mass-produced pamphlets, with a propaganda campaign that became the template for every blood libel that followed. When the Nazis rose to power in Germany in the 1930s, they did not invent the blood libel. They simply opened the archive and found it waiting for them. Julius Streicher, the publisher of the virulently anti-Semitic newspaper Der Stürmer, was obsessed with Simon of Trent. He reprinted the woodcuts from the Nuremberg Chronicle in his pages, presenting them as historical proof of Jewish ritual murder. He spoke of Simon at Nazi rallies, invoking the child's name as justification for the persecution that was to come. The same images that had been printed in 1493, the same lies that Hinderbach had commissioned that the Nuremberg printers had distributed, now appeared in German newspapers with new captions, new urgency, the same poison. Streicher understood something that Hinderbach had understood 5 centuries earlier. A lie, if it is old enough, begins to feel like truth. A lie, if it is repeated enough, becomes invisible. You do not need to prove that Jews murder children. You only need to remind people that they have always been told that Jews murder children. The memory of the lie becomes the proof of the lie. In 1946, Julius Streicher was convicted of crimes against humanity at Nuremberg, the same city whose chronicle had spread Simon's image across Europe. He was hanged, but the lie he had resurrected did not die with him. It went underground. It waited. In 2019, a white supremacist walked into a synagogue in Poway, California, and opened fire. He killed 1 person. He wounded 3 others. Before the attack, he posted a manifesto online. In that manifesto, he cited Simon of Trent. 544 years after a 2-year-old boy drowned in a canal, his name was still being used to justify murder. The lie has never been about Simon. Simon was just a body, a boy who wandered into the dark and never came home. The lie is about something deeper. It is about the human hunger for stories that make the world simple, for villains we can name, for guilt we can locate, for a narrative that explains suffering without asking us to look too closely at our own hands. The lie of Simon of Trent has survived popes who condemned it, historians who refuted it, centuries that should have rendered it absurd. It survives because it is useful. Because there is always someone who needs a child's blood to justify their hatred. Because a ghost, once summoned, does not return to its grave just because you tell it the truth. Simon of Trent is not a martyr. He never was. He is a story that 500 years of history could not kill. And as long as there are people who need that story, he will never die. For nearly 500 years, the shrine stood. For nearly 500 years, pilgrims came. For nearly 500 years, the Catholic Church, the same institution that had once sent investigators to uncover the truth, that had received the reports confirming the confessions were extracted by torture, that had known, in its archives, that Simon of Trent was not a martyr, permitted the veneration of a lie. There were moments when the truth almost broke through. In 1755, Pope Benedict XIV ordered a revision of the Roman Martyrology, the official catalogue of saints and blesseds. He instructed the revisers to examine the cult of Simon of Trent with care. The revisers did their work. They read the trial records. They saw, plainly, what had happened. 15 men burned on the word of tortured prisoners. A child's body used as a pretext for massacre. A cult built on nothing but propaganda and profit. The revisers recommended that Simon be removed, but the recommendation went nowhere. The cult was too old, too embedded. Too many people had prayed at that shrine, had believed in that martyr, had built their faith around that tiny body in its crystal casket. To remove Simon would be to admit that generations of Catholics had been venerating a fiction, that the Church had permitted for centuries the worship of a child whose sainthood was written in the screams of tortured men. So the Church did what institutions do when confronted with a truth they cannot bear. It looked away. It let the shrine stand. It let the feast day remain. It let the lie sleep undisturbed in the calendar of saints. The lie slept through the French Revolution, through the unification of Italy, through 2 world wars. It slept through the rise of Nazism, through the Holocaust, through the slaughter of 6 million Jews, 6 million men, women, children, whose murderers had drawn in part from the same poisoned well that Simon of Trent had filled. And then, in the 1960s, something shifted. The Second Vatican Council convened. It was the most significant gathering of Catholic bishops in a century, and its purpose was to ask difficult questions about what the Church believed and how it should live in the modern world. Among the documents that emerged from the Council was Nostra Aetate, the declaration on the relation of the Church to non-Christian religions. It was a short text, just a few pages, but its words were seismic. For the first time in history, the Catholic Church formally repudiated anti-Semitism. It declared that the Jews were not collectively responsible for the death of Christ. It called for mutual respect and dialogue between Christians and Jews. It did not mention Simon of Trent by name. It did not need to. The declaration's logic was clear. If the Church was to build a new relationship with the Jewish people, it could not continue to venerate a saint whose cult was built on the murder of Jewish men. In 1965, the Archbishop of Trent, Alessandro Maria Gottardi, took action. He ordered the removal of Simon's shrine. The crystal casket was taken away. The relics were secured. The name of Simon of Trent was struck from the calendar of saints. The cult, after nearly 5 centuries, was abolished. The Church did not make a spectacle of it. There was no grand announcement, no public trial of the old lies, no formal apology to the descendants of the 15 men who had burned. The cult simply stopped. The shrine was dismantled. The pilgrims stopped coming. The feast day was no longer observed. And Simon of Trent, the child who had been a martyr, a miracle worker, a weapon, became at last what he had always been: a dead boy, a tragedy, a name that most Catholics would never hear again. But erasing a saint is not the same as erasing a lie. The lie of Simon of Trent did not die in 1965. It had been alive too long. It had been printed in too many books, carved into too many shrines, whispered in too many sermons. It had become part of the architecture of European anti-Semitism, a foundation stone that could not be removed without bringing down the walls. Today, the name of Simon of Trent still circulates. It appears in white supremacist manifestos. It is invoked in online forums where hatred is cultivated and spread. It is used still by people who need a child's blood to justify their violence. The Church has repudiated the cult. Historians have refuted the story. The truth has been available for centuries to anyone who cared to find it. And yet, the lie survives. Because a lie that has lived for 500 years does not die just because you stop telling it. It dies only when something stronger takes its place. When understanding replaces fear. When complexity replaces simplicity. When we learn to look at a dead child, any dead child, and refuse to turn that death into a weapon. Simon of Trent was 2 years old. He wandered away from his father's door. He fell into a canal, or was placed there, or ended there by accident or violence. We will never know. What we know is that he was a child, just a child, and then he was taken. Not by Jews, not by ritual murderers, not by the villains of a preacher's sermon. He was taken by the story that needed him, the story that used him, the story that has outlived him by half a millennium. They say that every story has an ending, but some stories do not end. They circle, they return, they find new tongues to speak them, new hands to write them, new eyes to believe them. Simon of Trent was never a martyr. He was a boy who died. He was a body pulled from water. He was a name that 15 men screamed as the fire climbed their legs. He was a lie that became a saint. And now, Now here's a question that sits in the dark, waiting for each generation to answer it. When you hear a story that makes the world simple, that draws a line between the innocent and the guilty, the pure and the corrupt, the ones who belong and the ones who must be cast out, what will you do? Will you ask who told you this story? Will you ask what it cost to make it? Will you ask whose hands are bound in the small print? Whose screams are filed away in the archives? Whose blood waters the soil from which this beautiful, terrible narrative grows? Or will you light a candle? Will you kneel? Will you believe? The lie of Simon of Trent is not dead. It is waiting. It is always waiting for someone who needs a child to be more than a child. For someone who needs a villain to be more than a neighbor. For someone who will take a dead boy and make him into a sword. The question is not whether the lie will return. The question is what you will do when it finds you.